Today, we're going to talk about ethics. But before we proceed, we should note that ethics and morality are not the same thing, even though they are related and are often loosely interchanged with each other in terms of their use. For when we speak of morality, it is a set of standards a person, a group, or a society has as the basis of their judgment whether an act is good or bad, right or wrong, virtuous or not, or whether one should do this or not. In other words, people can have different morality in virtue of different standards of what is right and what is wrong. Morality can be best observed in different groups, whether cultural, religious, or society as a whole, where members share certain standards as guide for their actions, behaviors, and practices that they do. In some African countries, for instance, polygamy is acceptable. Muslims refrain from eating pork. Abortion is immoral to some groups, while moral to others. It is not hard to see why there are differences in morality. After all, such differences can be explained by different social influences on each individual regarding the idea of moral standard during their formative years. Our parents, for instance, constantly taught us when we were kids which behaviors that are right and behaviors that are wrong until those moral standards have become ingrained in us that we did not even bother to examine or reflect on them. Now, what is ethics? How is it related but different from morality? Strictly speaking, ethics is the field of rational inquiry that examines or investigates moral standards either of an individual or a group or a society. It assesses the reasonableness and acceptability of those standards. Also, ethics is the discipline that analyzes moral concepts like right, wrong, good, bad, virtue, obligation, and other relevant concepts. In short, ethics is the study of morality. Thus, in ethics, when we ask questions like, are these moral standards acceptable? Are these practices morally permissible? If they are permissible, how are they justified? Can we say that moral standards are subjective? What do we mean when we claim that an act is right or wrong? What is a good person? What is the concept of good anyway? What should we do as moral agents? How can we be happy? How should we live our lives? We are in effect subjecting our moral beliefs to critical evaluation and reflective analysis. Why? Because as rational moral beings, we do not or should not immediately accept any moral beliefs or standards without good supporting reasons. So, in ethics, what we essentially do is we perform critical examination with respect to our basic moral beliefs and views about morality. Without this exercise, we won't be able to reach a proper understanding of what morality is and determine the right and appropriate moral beliefs to accept and live by. As the great philosopher Socrates said, the unexamined life is not worth living. At this point, it is important that we reiterate that ethics, as the study of morality, deals only with human conduct. This is because human actions and how those actions affect other human beings, the community, or the society as a whole are the only objects of our moral judgments. We do not do this to animals and inanimate things. We do not express moral judgments towards them. While it is true that sometimes we say that a cat is a bad cat because it took away and ate our fried fish on the table, or a dog is a good dog because companionship with our dog takes away our emotional stresses from work, we do not take them to be moral beings. It doesn't make sense to blame the cat and have it locked up in jail for an act of stealing. Because blaming the cat for wrongdoing is like blaming a traffic jam that has caused inconvenience to us. Our evaluative judgments do not mean it that way. Why? Because animals and inanimate objects are devoid of sense of accountability and therefore cannot be held morally responsible. To be moral is to be responsible and hence to be accountable. Only human beings have a sense of responsibility and accountability. Thus, only human beings can be moral beings. This explains why morality is attributed only to human beings. This brings us to the main concerns of ethics as the study of morality. These concerns are usually identified as the three main areas of ethics. These are meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. Let us describe each. The first is meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is the branch of ethics that examines our fundamental assumptions and presuppositions about morality. It investigates the nature and meaning of moral statements as well as the foundations of moral concepts and values. It deals with questions like, what is the nature of moral statements? Are moral statements meaningful or meaningless? What are moral facts? Are moral facts objective? Do moral concepts like good, bad, right, wrong exist independently of the moral agent? Is morality objective or merely relative? What is goodness? An example of meta-ethical issue is about the nature of moral statements. For the view called cognitivism, moral statements can be true or false and therefore meaningful, while non-cognitivism views moral statements as having no truth value and hence devoid of meaning. In the case of the statement murder is wrong, for instance, a cognitivist would claim that the statement expresses a belief and represents reality, and therefore the statement can be true or false. However, a non-cognitivist would argue that the statement does not describe reality. The statement can either be an expression of command or simply an expression of emotion. Another issue is about moral facts and properties. To use the same example, the view called moral realism argues that murder is wrong, is a moral fact, because murder as an act possesses wrongness as its property. Anti-moral realism, on the other hand, denies the existence of moral facts and properties. These are some of the issues that meta-ethics aims to clarify and shed light on in relation to the fundamental concepts, ideas, and assumptions that underlie our moral beliefs. The next branch of ethics is normative ethics. Normative ethics is the branch of ethics that searches for the appropriate moral rules that will govern our actions, that will tell us what we should or should not do, or the ways of life we should pursue, and by which we can justify our judgment whether a particular action is good, bad, right, wrong, permissible or permissible, virtuous or not. That's exactly what normative means. When we say normative, it means rules of action or action guiding rules. Normative ethics, therefore, is prescriptive. There are three theories in normative ethics. These are teleological ethics, deontological ethics, and virtue ethics. Let us discuss them briefly. Teleological ethics, also known as consequentialist ethics, is the view that claims that our moral obligation is determined by the consequences of our actions. What matters to this view is that the rightness or wrongness of our action is solely judged as to whether our actions lead to good or bad outcome. What we ought to do for our action to be right, according to this view, is to act in such a way that the goal of our action is achieved by producing the desirable consequence. However, if our action leads to an undesirable outcome, and hence the goal is not achieved, we've done a wrong action. Thus, for consequentialist ethics, it's the goal of our action that is morally important and not how we achieve it. In other words, The end is what justifies the means. We should note that teleological or consequentialist ethics has some versions. For instance, if the goal of one's action is to promote one's own personal interest, then one embraces the view of egoism. For the only good for an egoist is self-interest. Hedonism, on the other hand, claims that pleasure is the only good. So a hedonist would say that everyone should act for the maximization of his or her own individual pleasure. By contrast, utilitarianism is the view that claims that everyone should seek the greatest amount of happiness for the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism, by far, is the most influential version of consequentialist ethics. Next is the deontological ethics. Deontological ethics is the view that considers an action as morally right or morally wrong, not from the consequences of the action, but from the performance of one's duty for duty's sake, which is the sole motive of one's action. Deontological ethics is therefore a non-consequentialist ethics. According to deontological ethics, the end never justifies the means. In themselves, actions are right or wrong regardless of their outcome or result. Our duty is to do the right actions no matter what. Telling a lie, for instance, is wrong in itself, whether it leads to a favorable outcome. Telling a lie will never be morally right because it's always morally wrong. Similarly, telling the truth is always morally right, even if it goes against your inclination and leads to unhappy consequences. Hence, our duty is to always tell the truth and not to tell lies. So in the ontological ethics, what is important for the rightness or wrongness of any moral action is the assessment of the motive, intention, and the action itself, whether they follow rules or perform certain obligations. The Ten Commandments and basic rights are some of the versions of the ontological ethics. The most influential version is one by Immanuel Kant. His version espouses one performance of duty in virtue of what he calls categorical imperative, which is formulated in terms of universality principle and the principle of humanity. The universality principle commands us as rational agents to only act on maxims that could be a universal law. And the humanity principle is telling us never to treat other people as only means to an end, but an end in themselves. For people deserve respect as rational and autonomous beings. The third major normative theory is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics rejects the action-based theories of consequentialist and deontological ethics and argues for a character-based account of morality instead. The object of moral evaluation is not the person's action, but his or her character. That is, whether a person's character is virtuous or not. Virtue ethics answers the question, what kind of person should I be? Or, what does it mean to be a good person? Or, how should I live as a moral person? By providing an account of what makes a person virtuous. For Aristotle's virtue ethics, to be a morally virtuous person is to be able to develop a habit of acting according to the mean between two extremes. The mean is the virtuous character, while the extremes are the vicious characters. For instance, courage is a virtuous character, while cowardice and rashness are vices. Another example is temperance as a virtue, and the vices are insensibility and self-indulgence. Another would be generosity as a virtuous character, but stinginess and extravagance are vices. Once the habit has been developed, practical wisdom ensues, and the virtuous person shall live a fully happy life. Eastern ethics such as Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism are some of the other forms of virtue ethics. Applied ethics is the third main branch of ethics. As the name suggests, applied ethics is the application of concepts, methods, and principles from meta-ethics and normative ethics to the more practical concerns of morality. It examines and focuses on particular social and personal issues that call for appropriate moral judgment. Using moral theories, applied ethics seeks to evaluate whether a specific practice or behavior is morally permissible. Issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, euthanasia, death penalty, prostitution, divorce, and corporal punishment are some of the commonly known topics that are in need of proper evaluation. In recent decades, more issues have been magnified and increased, brought about by modern technology that gave rise to things like genetic engineering, stem cell research, internet communication, artificial intelligence, in vitro fertilization, and other things related to business, public policy, media, medicine, law, and environment. The question of permissibility as to the kind of action people should do in relation to activities like the ones we have mentioned is a valid ethical concern. Thus, in this present age, inquiring into the question of what is right and wrong has become more relevant than ever. There is a need to articulate, analyze, evaluate, and make rational judgments pertaining to moral issues. The aim of applied ethics is to shed light and address various ethical issues to guide us in making moral judgment. Before we end our discussion, we need to mention that there are fields that also study morality. These fields conduct empirical investigation regarding the moral attitudes, beliefs, and practices of individuals or groups of individuals in cultures and societies. Psychology, for instance, would like to know how a person's sense of moral responsibility develops as part of the development of human behavior. Developmental psychology is one area of psychology that seeks to provide an account of how moral reasoning in kids develops. Sociology, on the other hand, conducts research on how moral norms are practiced by a particular society or a group. One possible sociological study is how moral behaviors are regulated in a society. Anthropology may give an account of how moral decisions are made in various cultures. In this case, anthropology can even come up with a comparative study of moral beliefs and practices in different cultures. What all these fields aim to do is provide us with an account of how people behave and think and reason about morality. The goal of their study is not to question whether those moral customs are acceptable or unacceptable and prescribe how people should behave according to the moral standard they ought to live by. Their main objective is to give us factual accounts about morality. In other words, they are descriptive and not normative. Ethics, on the other hand, is normative. It prescribes what morality must be and how people ought to live. Thus, those fields do not belong to the main concerns of ethics. I hope you've learned something valuable today. Thank you for your time.